All right, so um, imagine walking into, your polling place, ready to vote, but instead of getting a ballot, you get like an exam.
An exam.
Yeah, and you got to pass it to vote.
Hmm.
Otherwise, no vote for you.
Wow.
It sounds kind of like sci-fi, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
But believe it or not, that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Okay.
It's this idea of, well, they call it epistocracy.
Yeah.
Basically, it's about restricting voting based on, like, how much you know.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, it's gotten pretty controversial, actually.
I can imagine.
So we're going to tackle the big arguments for and against it, try to figure out, like, how you'd even measure knowledge in the first place.
Right, right.
And then we'll even look at some real-world examples that might surprise you.
I'm intrigued.
So to kind of set the stage here, it seems like the core tension is this.
Hmm.
Do we want everyone to have an equal say?
Right.
Or do we want to make sure that the people making decisions are, well, the most informed ones?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And it's not just a theoretical debate. It
Uh-huh.
really ties into these ongoing discussions about what democracy is really all about,
Right, right.
like at its core. And there are some really important thinkers who've explored these ideas. You might have heard of Robert Dahl.
I think so, yeah.
He wrote On Political Equality, and he's a big proponent of, everyone having an equal voice.
Makes sense.
But then you have folks like Jason Brennan who wrote Against Democracy.
And that's democracy.
Yeah, bold title, right. And he actually argues that voters who aren't informed often make decisions based on, emotion or like bad information.
Oh, I see.
He thinks that if you limited voting to people who could prove they know their stuff, you'd get better results, more rational policies.
I mean, it's kind of appealing on the surface, right?
Sure.
Like an informed electorate making smarter choices.
Exactly. But the big BUT here, and it's a huge E but, is this. How do we even agree on what informed means?
Oh, good point.
That opens up a whole other can of worms, doesn't it? Like, whose knowledge matters? Who decides that?
Yeah.
It gets complicated fast.
Really fast. But let's say, for argument's sake, we could somehow figure that out.
Okay.
Wouldn't we be, like, going against the whole point of democracy? I mean, isn't the idea that everyone gets a voice, like, no matter what?
Absolutely. That's a core democratic principle, equal representation. Everyone's voice matters. And this ties directly back to what Dahl was warning about discrimination.
Discrimination.
Yeah, unfortunately, historically, these so-called knowledge tests haven't been about improving decisions.
Oh.
They've been used to exclude certain groups, often marginalized ones.
Yeah, yikes.
So even if you had good intentions, trying to limit voting based on knowledge, it's a really slippery slope.
It really does make you wonder, how on earth would you measure knowledge fairly in the first place?
Exactly. And that's one of the biggest practical challenges with this whole epistocracy idea. It all boils down to subjectivity, right? Like any criteria you come up with for this test, it's going to be open to bias. Like who's writing these questions? Who decides what information is important enough to be on the test? You can see how quickly it falls apart.
Totally. And, it reminds me of something we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
literacy tests, like back in the Jim Crow South.
Oh, right, right.
They used those to stop black people from voting.
Exactly. It wasn't about literacy at all. It was about power and control.
It's a stark reminder of how easily things can go wrong when you start messing with voting rights.
It really is. And it's not just a thing of the past.
Really?
Yeah. Think about the debates we're having today about voter ID laws.
Oh, right.
It's a similar kind of issue.
How so?
Well, people who support them, they say it's about preventing voter fraud.
Uh-huh.
But critics argue that those laws can end up preventing minorities and low-income voters from voting.
Because they might not have the right ID. Right.
Exactly. And it just goes to show, anytime you try to make it harder for certain groups to vote, you risk creating unfair barriers.
So we've talked a lot about the arguments against epistocracy, about the potential for bias and discrimination.
Right.
But is there, like, anything to be said for the other side,
Sure.
besides just, wanting a more informed electorate?
Yeah, it's fair to say that people who support epistocracy, they often do have some legitimate concerns about how political decisions are made.
Okay.
They worry about the quality of political discourse.
Right.
And they think that if voters were more knowledgeable, we'd have better policies, more rational ones based on evidence that would actually help society as a whole.
So it sounds like no matter what side of this debate you're on, everyone agrees that an informed citizenry is important.
I think that's a safe bet.
So maybe the real question isn't about who gets to vote, but how do we make sure everyone is informed?
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. If we all agree that we want an informed electorate, the next step is figuring out how to get there. Is
Exciting.
it through education? Or by making sure everyone has access to, reliable information that isn't biased?
Right. And how do we even make sure that those things like education and information aren't being used to manipulate people?
Ah, there you go. That's
Yeah.
the real challenge. This debate, it's not going away anytime soon.
Definitely not. It's something we all need to be thinking about.
Absolutely.
So what about you?
Hmm.
If you were in charge, how would you create a system to make sure voters were informed? What would be at the top of your list?